I was on my porch, coffee in hand, looking out over the lawn I'd spent the better part of a decade perfecting. This wasn't just grass to me. It was a sanctuary, a testament to the order and discipline I'd built my life around. But that morning, the order was broken. A gleaming black SUV, the kind that costs more than my first house, was parked squarely in the middle of my lawn, its oversized tires crushing the tender new grass. For a moment, I just stared, the steam from my coffee cup swirling in the cool air. It was so brazen, so utterly contemptuous, that my mind couldn't immediately process it. This wasn't a mistake. No one, accidentally, parks a 3-ton vehicle on a manicured lawn. This was a statement. I set my mug down on the railing, the ceramic clicking softly in the quiet. My first instinct was to handle it directly. I walked over to my neighbor's house, a sprawling new construction that had gone up last year. The owner was a man named Richard Sterling, a slick 40-something finance guy with a condescending smirk and a reputation for treating the neighborhood like his personal kingdom. I knocked on his door, a firm, measured rap. He opened it, already wearing his trademark smirk, dressed in an expensive golf shirt. "Can I help you, buddy?" he asked, his tone dripping with false friendliness. "Rich," I started, keeping my voice level. "Your car is on my lawn." He glanced past me, then back, his smirk widening. "Yeah, I know. Had some friends over last night, ran out of space in the driveway. What's the big deal? It's just grass." "The big deal," I said, my patience already wearing thin, "is that it's my property. I need you to move it." He chuckled, a short, barking sound. "Look, I'll get to it when I get to it. Don't get your panties in a twist." And with that, he shut the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, the quiet fury building in my chest. This wasn't just disrespect. It was a calculated display of dominance. He was testing me. He was marking his territory. I knew going to the HOA would be my next logical step, but I also knew it would be useless. The HOA was run by a woman named Carol Peterson, a retired busybody who was completely in Sterling's pocket. She was enamored with his wealth and influence, and she let him get away with murder. But protocol was protocol. I walked down to the community office and found her arranging pamphlets. I explained the situation calmly and professionally. She listened with a look of feigned concern, then gave me a patronizing smile. "Oh, Frank," she said, using my first name like we were old friends. "I'm sure it was just an oversight. Richard is a very important member of our community. Let's not make waves over something so trivial. I'm sure he'll move it eventually." I looked at her perfectly coiffed hair and her smug, unshakable certainty. She wasn't just dismissing me. She was protecting him. She was an accomplice. I walked out of that office without another word. The battle lines had been drawn. They thought this was about a patch of grass. They thought I was just some quiet veteran who would eventually give up. But here's what they didn't know. I spent 20 years in the Army as a logistics officer. My entire career was built around moving assets, navigating regulations, and dismantling complex problems piece by piece. They had just parked their car in the middle of a problem they couldn't possibly comprehend. They thought they were dealing with a gardener. They were about to find out they were dealing with a master of logistics. And I was about to make their prized possession disappear, not just from my lawn, but forever. Let me know in the comments if you think I was right to escalate this. My history in this neighborhood runs deeper than the foundations of Rich Sterling's oversized house. I bought this place 25 years ago, a small, unassuming ranch house on a half-acre lot. It was all I could afford after my first tour overseas. My wife and I raised our 2 kids here. We planted the oak tree in the front yard when our daughter was born. It's taller than the house now. This isn't just a piece of property to me. It's a living record of my family's life. It's where I came home to after deployments in places I can't talk about. It's the ground I stood on when I taught my son how to throw a baseball. Every square inch of it was earned with sweat and sacrifice. My military background isn't something I advertise. I'm not the guy with the proud veteran bumper sticker. My 20 years in the Army taught me that you don't talk about your capabilities. You demonstrate them when necessary. As a logistics officer, my job was to solve impossible problems. I've coordinated the movement of entire brigades across continents. I've navigated the labyrinthine regulations of foreign governments to get critical supplies to the front lines. I once had to figure out how to get a Black Hawk helicopter off a mountain in the middle of a blizzard using nothing but a Russian transport plane and a lot of paperwork. My specialty is finding the loophole, the overlooked statute, the precise regulation that allows me to do what needs to be done. I'm a master of the fine print. This community standing, this quiet respect I'd earned, was something I valued. I was the guy people called when they needed help fixing a leaky pipe or jump-starting a car. I kept to myself, maintained my property, and respected my neighbors. When Sterling moved in, he shattered that unspoken contract. He saw my quiet nature not as a sign of a peaceful man, but as a sign of a weak one. He saw my modest home as an eyesore next to his McMansion. He didn't see a neighbor. He saw territory to be conquered. But there was another layer to my background, a hidden credential that even my closest neighbors didn't know about. After I retired from the Army, I did a 5-year stint as a civilian contractor for the General Services Administration, the GSA. That's the agency that manages all federal property. My job was to handle asset forfeiture and disposal. When the government seizes property, cars, boats, houses, from criminals, it was my job to process it, manage the paperwork, and oversee its auction or disposal according to strict federal guidelines. I know the Asset Forfeiture Code, Title 18 of the U.S. Code, better than I know my own phone number. I know the exact process, the specific forms, the precise legal triggers for seizing a piece of property. It was a unique and highly specialized skill set. And as I stood on my porch, looking at that arrogant black SUV bleeding oil onto my lawn, I realized that Richard Sterling had just parked his car directly in the crosshairs of my very specific expertise. He thought he was just being a bully. He had no idea he was about to become the subject of a masterclass in federal asset forfeiture. The HOA, under Carol Peterson's leadership, was nothing more than a private club for the wealthy and influential. Carol, a woman in her late 60s with a penchant for pastel tracksuits and a thirst for vicarious power, had been president for a decade. Her entire strategy was to curry favor with the wealthiest residents, like Sterling, while enforcing the rules with draconian zeal on everyone else. If your trash can was left out an hour too long, you got a fine. If your grass was a 1/4 inch too high, you got a warning letter. But if Rich Sterling wanted to build a hideous, non-compliant marble fountain in his front yard, Carol would personally shepherd the variance through the committee. Her corruption wasn't just social, it was financial. The HOA's preferred contractor for all community projects, landscaping, road maintenance, you name it, was a company called Prestige Exteriors. A little digging revealed that Prestige Exteriors was owned by Carol's son-in-law. They overcharged for everything, and their work was shoddy. The beautiful cherry trees that used to line our main street had all died and been replaced with cheap, scraggly maples by Prestige Exteriors, at twice the cost of the original landscaper's bid. The community's reserve funds were being systematically drained into her family's pockets. I wasn't the first person to run afoul of the Sterling-Peterson alliance. A year ago, a young couple, the Garcias, had moved in next door to Sterling. They had a small dog, a beagle. Sterling complained to Carol that the dog's occasional barking was a nuisance. Carol began fining the Garcias $50 a day. They tried to fight it, pointing out that Sterling's own pool parties often went late into the night with loud music. Carol dismissed their complaints and continued the fines. After 6 months, buried under thousands of dollars in fines and legal threats, the Garcias were forced to sell their home. Sterling bought it through an LLC for well below market value and now uses it as a guest house. He hadn't just gotten rid of a neighbor he didn't like. He'd profited from it. Carol's harassment campaign against me started subtly after my initial complaint. First, I received a notice that my mailbox, the same one that had been there for 20 years, was now in violation of a newly invented aesthetic standard. Then came a warning about the color of my trim, which was suddenly deemed out of compliance. It was a war of 1,000 paper cuts, designed to wear me down, to make me feel powerless. Each letter, printed on the HOA's official letterhead, was a reminder that she was in charge, that she made the rules, and that I was in her crosshairs. But every letter she sent was a mistake. She was creating a paper trail. She was documenting her own pattern of targeted harassment. And I was filing every single piece of it away in a folder labeled Evidence. My first move was to establish a legal framework. I spent a full day at the county law library, cross-referencing state and local property laws. I found what I was looking for in a little-known municipal code regarding abandoned and nuisance vehicles on private property. It stated that if a vehicle was left on private property for more than 72 hours without the owner's consent, it could be legally declared abandoned and towed at the owner's expense. But I wasn't interested in just towing it. That was temporary. I wanted a permanent solution. That's where my GSA background came in. I knew that local and federal laws often intersect in strange ways. I started digging into environmental regulations. Sterling's SUV was a high-end model, but it was a few years old, and I'd noticed a small dark patch on my lawn where it had been parked. I took a soil sample and sent it to a private lab for analysis. The results came back a week later. High concentrations of petroleum distillates and heavy metals, consistent with a chronic oil leak. According to EPA regulations, the deliberate leaking of hazardous materials onto residential soil is a federal offense. Sterling wasn't just parking on my lawn, he was contaminating it. Now I had a federal hook. I drafted a formal complaint, not to the local police, but to the regional EPA enforcement office. I detailed the situation, included the lab results, and cited the specific federal statutes being violated. I also made a call to an old colleague at the GSA, a guy in the Asset Forfeiture Division. I explained the situation hypothetically. What if, I said, a vehicle used in the commission of a federal environmental crime was also in violation of local nuisance laws? My friend was quiet for a moment. That's interesting, he said. Technically, if the vehicle is an instrument of a federal crime, it could be subject to federal seizure. The pieces were all clicking into place. My final preparation was to build a coalition. I knew I couldn't be the only one who had a problem with Carol and Sterling. I spent an evening walking the neighborhood, talking to my neighbors. I didn't mention my plan. I just listened. I heard about the absurd fines, the corrupt contracts, the general feeling of powerlessness. I spoke to the Garcias, who were now renting an apartment across town. They were still terrified of Sterling, but they agreed to provide a sworn affidavit about their experience. I gathered a dozen similar stories, each one a testament to Carol's reign of terror. I wasn't just fighting for my lawn anymore. I was fighting for my entire community. The confrontation escalated faster than I expected. After his car was gone for a few days, he'd moved it after my initial complaint, but then defiantly parked it there again. Sterling seemed to realize I wasn't backing down. He switched tactics from passive aggression to outright intimidation. One night, my security cameras caught him walking to the edge of my property and deliberately kicking over my trash cans, sending garbage spilling across my driveway. The next day, I received a certified letter from the HOA's law firm, a cease and desist order accusing me of harassing Mr. Sterling and demanding I remove my unauthorized surveillance equipment. The community, however, was starting to stir. My quiet conversations had planted seeds of dissent. A small group of neighbors organized a special meeting to question the HOA's budget and the Prestige Exteriors contract. Carol, flustered and defensive, refused to answer any specific questions, which only fueled the suspicion. The local news got wind of the story, a classic tale of a powerful HOA bullying a veteran. A reporter started sniffing around, interviewing residents and filing public records requests for the HOA's financial documents. Sterling, seeing his untouchable status begin to crumble, made his biggest mistake. He confronted me in my own driveway as I was getting out of my car. My security camera, the one he'd demanded I take down, recorded the entire thing. "You think you're clever, don't you, old man?" he snarled, getting right in my face. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I will bury you in legal fees. I will own this house. You and your family will be out on the street." That was the moment I had been waiting for. The threat. It was clear, direct, and unambiguous, and it was on tape. Carol, in a panic, called an emergency HOA meeting to try and regain control. She planned to publicly censure me and vote to place a lien on my house for conduct detrimental to the community. It was a show trial, and the whole neighborhood was invited. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse. The room was packed. Carol stood at the podium, looking severe and powerful. Sterling sat in the front row like a king in his court. Carol launched into a tirade about my disruptive and aggressive behavior. She painted me as a troublemaker who was tearing the community apart. When she finished, she opened the floor for comments, clearly expecting her allies to chime in. Instead, an elderly woman in the back, Sanctuor, stood up. "I'd like to know," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "why my roof repair, done by Prestige Exteriors, cost 30% more than the 3 other quotes I got." A murmur went through the room. Another resident stood up. "And I'd like to see the minutes from the meeting where that contract was approved." Carol's face went pale. The meeting was spiraling out of her control. She tried to shut it down, but it was too late. The dam had broken. Then I stood up. I walked to the front of the room, holding a small tablet. "Carol," I said, my voice calm and clear, "you've accused me of harassment, but I think this community deserves to see what real harassment looks like." I turned the tablet to the crowd and hit play. The video of Sterling in my driveway, threatening to ruin me, filled the screen. The room went dead silent. You could see the shock on people's faces. Sterling, for the first time, looked scared. I let the video play out. Then I looked directly at Carol. "For weeks," I said, "this board has ignored a legitimate complaint while actively participating in a campaign of intimidation against my family. You've used this HOA as your own personal piggy bank and your own private army." I paused, letting the words sink in. "But that's a local issue. I've also filed a formal complaint with the Environmental Protection Agency regarding Mr. Sterling's illegal disposal of hazardous waste onto my property." I looked at Sterling. "And you should know, Rich, that under Title 18 of the U.S. Code, any property used in the commission of a federal crime is subject to asset forfeiture. Your car isn't just a nuisance vehicle anymore. It's evidence in a federal investigation." The room erupted. Carol stood at the podium, speechless, her face ashen. Sterling looked like he'd been punched in the gut. The authority they had wielded for so long had vanished in an instant. They hadn't just picked a fight with the wrong neighbor. They had picked a fight with a man who knew the rules better than they did, and they had just found out that the game was rigged in my favor. The retaliation was swift and multi-pronged. The day after the HOA meeting, 2 agents from the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division showed up at Sterling's house. They had a warrant. They took soil samples from my lawn and from the area around the storm drain in front of his house. They also impounded the black SUV, not as a towed vehicle, but as evidence in a federal case. The sight of his prized possession being loaded onto a flatbed truck by federal agents sent a shockwave through the neighborhood. Simultaneously, the local news story broke. The reporter had uncovered the shell company, the inflated contracts, and the family ties between Carol and Prestige Exteriors. The headline was brutal: HOA, President accused of corruption and cover-up. The State Attorney General's office launched a formal investigation into the HOA's finances, freezing all of its assets. Carol's piggy bank was officially closed. The legal reversal was total. The HOA's lawsuit against me was thrown out of court. The judge, after watching the video of Sterling's threats, issued a permanent restraining order against him, barring him from setting foot on my property or communicating with me or my family in any way. The criminal charges followed soon after. Sterling was charged with making criminal threats and multiple violations of the Clean Water Act. Carol and her son-in-law were indicted on charges of fraud and embezzlement. The financial consequences were catastrophic for them. Sterling's legal fees were astronomical. The EPA fined him over $100,000 for the environmental damage, and he was forced to pay for a full soil remediation of my lawn. His SUV was officially seized by the federal government through asset forfeiture. I got a call from my friend at the GSA a few months later. "You see a 2021 black Lincoln Navigator on the GSA auction site next month," he said. "You'll know where it came from." The car was gone, sold to the highest bidder to pay for his crimes. Carol was forced to pay back every cent she had funneled through the corrupt contracts, bankrupting her. The final victory was the complete and total destruction of the old power structure. Carol and her cronies were voted off the HOA board in a landslide. A new board, made up of honest, community-minded residents, was elected. Their first act was to terminate the contract with Prestige Exteriors and hire a reputable, local landscaping company. They also rewrote the bylaws to include strict transparency and anti-corruption measures. The community was restored. The fear and suspicion that had permeated the neighborhood for years was replaced by a sense of cooperation and relief. People started talking to each other again. The Garcias, with financial help from a community fund, were able to buy a new house in the neighborhood, their beagle happily and legally barking in the backyard. Carol's downfall was absolute. She was convicted of fraud and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Her reputation was ruined, her power gone. Sterling, facing federal charges, took a plea deal. He paid massive fines, served 6 months in a minimum security prison, and was forced to sell his house to cover his debts. The new owners are a quiet family who keep their cars in their own driveway. My legacy in this fight wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring order. It was about proving that the rules apply to everyone, no matter how rich or powerful you think you are. A few weeks after it was all over, I was out on my lawn, laying down new sod. My son came out to help me. "You know, Dad," he said, "I never thought you'd get that car off our lawn." I smiled and looked out at the peaceful, quiet street. "Son," I said, "there's a procedure for everything.